The morning mist clung to the abandoned shopping mall like a shroud, but Casimir Volkov knew better than to let the peaceful facade deceive him. 2 years after the outbreak had reduced humanity to scattered pockets of survivors, peace was always temporary. He stood atop the mall's roof, his weathered hands gripping a pair of binoculars as he scanned the perimeter for any sign of the infected. The irony wasn't lost on him that a place once dedicated to mindless consumption had become their sanctuary against the mindless undead. Below him, the sound of hammering echoed through the corridors as his people continued their endless work of fortification. Casimir had been a structural engineer before the world ended, designing bridges and buildings that were meant to last centuries. Now he designed barriers meant to last until tomorrow. The mall had been his idea, a fortress with multiple levels, controllable access points, and enough space for a growing community. What he hadn't anticipated was how difficult it would be to transform a monument to capitalism into a beacon of human cooperation. "The northern watchtower needs reinforcement," came a voice behind him. Alicia Nightingale climbed through the roof access, her medical bag slung across her shoulder even at this early hour. She had been a pediatrician before, spending her days healing children's scraped knees and checking their growth charts. Now she stitched bite wounds and amputated infected limbs, her gentle hands learning the harsh mathematics of survival. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and dark circles under her green eyes spoke of another sleepless night tending to the injured. Casimir lowered his binoculars and studied her face. Alicia had a way of delivering bad news with clinical detachment, but he could read the worry in the set of her shoulders. "How many this time?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. 3 confirmed bites from yesterday's supply run. Thaddeus is already preparing the quarantine area. She paused, watching a lone crow pick at something in the parking lot below. "Casimir, we can't keep losing people like this. Every run costs us more than we gain." The weight of leadership pressed down on Casimir's shoulders like a physical thing. Each decision rippled through their community of 47 souls, 44 now, if Alicia's news was as final as her tone suggested. Thaddeus Grimwald, their head of security and a former army sergeant, had warned him that scavenging missions were becoming increasingly dangerous. The initial chaos after the outbreak had left plenty of supplies scattered throughout the city, but 2 years later, the easy pickings were gone. Now they had to venture further from safety, into territories where the infected had learned to hunt in packs. "What about the greenhouse project?" Casimir asked, grasping for hope. Dmitri seemed optimistic about the tomato yield. Alicia's expression softened slightly. Dmitri Ashworth had been an urban farmer before the outbreak, one of those people who grew vegetables on rooftops and preached about sustainable living to anyone who would listen. His expertise had become invaluable in their efforts to achieve food independence. The makeshift greenhouse they'd constructed in the mall's former electronics store was small, but it represented something larger, the possibility of a future beyond mere survival. He is optimistic, but optimism doesn't change the fact that we need protein, medicines, and tools we can't grow or make ourselves. Alicia moved to stand beside him at the roof's edge. Isadora has been working with the children on education programs, trying to preserve knowledge for whatever comes next. But what comes next if we all starve or get bitten retrieving canned goods? Casimir knew she was right. Isadora Castellano, their former high school history teacher, had become their unofficial keeper of human knowledge. She ran classes for the children and organized efforts to preserve books, technical manuals, and cultural artifacts. But preserving civilization required more than just knowledge, it required people to be alive to use that knowledge. A distant sound made both of them freeze, the unmistakable moan of infected voices carrying on the wind. It was coming from the east, where their latest scouting reports had indicated clear passages. Casimir raised his binoculars again, scanning the tree line that bordered the mall's eastern approach. At first he saw nothing, but then movement caught his eye. Not the shambling gait of individual infected, but something more organized, more purposeful. "Get Thaddeus," he said quietly, never taking his eyes from the binoculars. "And tell him to alert the others. We have company coming, and they're moving like they know exactly where they're going." Alicia was already moving toward the roof access when the first clear sight of their approaching visitors became visible through the morning mist. Casimir felt his blood run cold as he counted at least 30 infected, moving in formation toward their home. This wasn't random wandering, this was a hunt. The emergency meeting convened in what had once been the mall's food court, now converted into their community's central gathering space. Long tables made from salvaged materials formed a rough circle, and the afternoon light filtering through the skylight cast everything in stark shadows. Casimir studied the faces around him, seeing his own tension reflected in their expressions. These were the people he'd chosen to help lead their small civilization, and now they faced their greatest challenge yet. Thaddeus Grimwald sat with his arms crossed, his scarred face grim as he processed the intelligence Casimir had shared. The former sergeant had seen combat in 3 different theaters before the outbreak, but fighting other humans was different from fighting an enemy that felt no pain and knew no fear. His tactical mind was already working through defensive scenarios, though his frown suggested none of them looked particularly promising. 30 confirmed, possibly more, Thaddeus said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making life-or-death decisions under pressure. Moving in coordinated groups, approaching from multiple vectors. This isn't typical infected behavior. Something's driving them, organizing them. Serafina Blackwood leaned forward from her position at the communication station she'd rigged from salvaged electronics. Before the outbreak, she had been a radio engineer, and her technical skills had proven invaluable in maintaining contact with other survivor groups. Her equipment was a patchwork of repurposed components, but it kept them connected to the outside world. "I've been monitoring the emergency frequencies," she said, adjusting the wire-rimmed glasses that had become her trademark. "There's chatter from settlements to the south and west. They're reporting similar organized movements. Whatever this is, it's not isolated to us." Dimitri Ashworth wiped soil from his hands with a stained cloth, having rushed directly from the greenhouse when the alarm sounded. His clothes still smelled of growing things, a reminder of the life they were trying to build amid so much death. "The perimeter sensors I installed near the vegetable plots are showing movement patterns," he said, consulting a notebook filled with his careful observations. "The infected aren't just wandering anymore. They're testing our defenses, probing for weaknesses." Isadora Castellano sat with several hand-drawn maps spread before her, her teacher's instincts for organization evident in the careful notations covering the paper. She had been documenting everything about their settlement, creating a record for future generations, but now her historical perspective offered a different kind of insight. "This reminds me of animal migration patterns," she said thoughtfully. "Something environmental might be driving them. A change in weather, food scarcity, or..." She paused, her face paling. "Or they're being herded by something else." The possibility hung in the air like a toxic cloud. They had all heard rumors of infected that retained more intelligence than the typical shambling corpses, but confirming such reports was different from facing the reality. Alicia broke the uncomfortable silence, her medical training making her focus on practical concerns even as fear gnawed at her composure. "We have medical supplies for perhaps a dozen serious injuries," she said, consulting her inventory lists. "If we're facing a coordinated assault, we need to assume casualties. I've prepared the surgical area, but I can't perform miracles with bandages and aspirin." Casimir felt the familiar weight of command settling on his shoulders. Every face around the table looked to him for answers, for a plan that would keep their fragile community alive. He had never wanted to be a leader, but the outbreak had a way of thrusting responsibility onto those willing to accept it. The bridge builder in him thought in terms of load distribution and structural integrity, but defending against thinking enemies required different calculations. "Our advantages are position and preparation," he said, spreading his own architectural drawings across the table. The mall gives us elevated positions, controlled choke points, and multiple fallback positions. Our disadvantages are numbers and supplies. He traced defensive lines with his finger, showing how they could channel attackers into predetermined killing zones. Thaddeus nodded approvingly. The main entrances are already barricaded and trapped. We can funnel them into narrow corridors where superior numbers mean less. But if they're truly coordinated, they might try multiple simultaneous breaches. What about evacuation? Asked Serafina, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. My equipment isn't portable, and we'd lose our communication network. We're not running, Casimir said firmly. This is our home. We've put too much work into building something here to abandon it at the first real test. He looked around the table, meeting each person's eyes. But everyone needs to understand what we're facing. This isn't a temporary threat we can wait out. If these infected are truly organized, they represent a fundamental change in how we survive. Dmitri stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the gardens they'd cultivated with such care. The children should be moved to the most secure areas, he said quietly. Whatever happens, we need to protect the future. Isadora gathered her maps with practiced efficiency. I'll coordinate the evacuation of non-combatants to the upper levels. The old department store anchor has the fewest access points. She paused, looking at the faces of her fellow leaders. And I'll make sure our knowledge archives are secured. If something happens to us, someone needs to find what we've built here. As the meeting dissolved into specific planning sessions, Casimir remained seated, staring at his architectural drawings. He had designed this place as a fortress, but every fortress had eventually fallen to a determined enemy. The question wasn't whether they could hold indefinitely, but whether they could hold long enough to prove that civilization was worth rebuilding. Outside, the first shadows of evening began to creep across the parking lot, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of approaching footsteps grew steadily closer. Night fell like a curtain over their fortified mall, and with it came the first probing attacks. Casimir crouched behind a reinforced barricade on the second floor, watching through night vision binoculars as shapes moved deliberately through the parking lot below. The infected weren't charging mindlessly toward the entrances as they had expected. Instead, they moved with an eerie patience, testing different approaches and studying the defenses with an intelligence that chilled him to the bone. North entrance, 3 groups of 4, Thaddeus whispered into his radio from his position in the former bookstore that now served as their primary observation post. His voice carried none of its usual confidence. In all his years of military service, he had never faced an enemy that combined the relentlessness of the infected with tactical thinking. They're not attacking. They're learning. Alicia had established her medical station in the central corridor, close enough to respond to casualties but protected from direct assault. The surgical lights she'd rigged cast harsh shadows on the walls, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a field hospital than the shopping center it had once been. Her hands remained steady as she prepared instruments, but Casimir could see the tension in her shoulders. Every few minutes, she would glance toward the upper levels where the children and elderly had been evacuated, her protective instincts warring with her duty to remain ready for the wounded. Movement on the west side, reported Serafina from her communications hub. Her radio equipment crackled with static as she monitored multiple frequencies, trying to coordinate their defense while maintaining contact with other survivor settlements. Dimitri's perimeter sensors are going crazy. Whatever they're doing out there, it's not random. Dmitri himself was positioned near the makeshift greenhouse, his farmer's knowledge of the land proving unexpectedly valuable in understanding their attackers' movements. He had spent hours observing infected behavior around their settlement, documenting patterns that others missed. Now that expertise was revealing disturbing truths about their current situation. They're not just testing our defenses, he said quietly into his radio. They're testing us. Watching how we respond, how we communicate, where we position our people. He paused, studying the shadows through his scope. These aren't mindless predators anymore. They're students, and we're the lesson. The first real assault came without warning. One moment the parking lot was filled with cautiously moving shapes, and the next, 20 infected were sprinting toward the main entrance with coordinated precision. But instead of the expected frontal assault, they split into smaller groups, each targeting a different weak point simultaneously. The careful strategy was unmistakably intelligent, and it sent a wave of fear through the defenders. Thaddeus's voice crackled over the radio as he coordinated the response. All units, maintain positions. Do not break formation to pursue. His military training told him this was likely a feint, designed to draw defenders out of position for the real attack. But watching the infected move with such purposeful coordination challenged everything he thought he knew about urban warfare. Isadora had taken responsibility for the children and elderly on the upper floors, transforming the old department store into a secure haven. Her historical knowledge had taught her about siege warfare, and she applied those lessons to organizing their noncombatants. Food, water, medical supplies, and escape routes were all carefully planned. But as she watched the attack unfold through a fortified window, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were witnessing something unprecedented in human history. The infected are adapting faster than we anticipated, she observed, her teacher's instincts for analysis overriding her fear. This level of tactical thinking suggests either evolution or outside control. Either possibility changes everything about our survival strategies. The attack on the main entrance was fierce but brief. The infected tested the barricades, found them well defended, and withdrew with the same coordination they had displayed in approaching. But the retreat wasn't random either. They pulled back to specific positions, maintaining sight lines and communication with each other. It was a textbook tactical withdrawal, executed by creatures that should have been incapable of such sophisticated thinking. Casualties? Casimir called over the radio, though the brief engagement had been more reconnaissance than battle. None, reported Thaddeus, but his tone carried no relief. They weren't trying to break through. They were gathering intelligence. Alicia moved through the corridors, checking on the defenders and treating minor injuries from the hasty defensive preparations. Her medical training had taught her to read the signs of shock and exhaustion in patients, and she could see both in the faces around her. The psychological impact of facing intelligent infected was taking its toll on their people, even more than physical wounds might have. "We need to talk," she said to Casimir as she passed his position. "Not about tactics or defenses. About what this means for everything we've built here." Serafina's voice cut through the relative quiet as she monitored communications from other settlements. "I'm getting reports from the eastern communities," she announced. "Similar coordinated attacks, same pattern of reconnaissance and withdrawal. Whatever's organizing these infected, it's happening across a wide area." The implications settled over the defenders like a heavy blanket. This wasn't an isolated incident or a random mutation in local infected behavior. They were facing something that had the scope and organization to coordinate attacks across multiple survivor settlements simultaneously. The comfortable assumption that they were simply hiding from mindless predators had been shattered. "How long until the next attack?" asked Dmitri, though he suspected none of them knew the answer. Casimir studied the parking lot through his binoculars, watching as the infected maintained their new positions. They weren't leaving, but they weren't attacking either. They were waiting, and the patience they displayed was perhaps the most frightening thing of all. "I don't think there will be another attack tonight," he said finally. "I think they're planning something bigger." As if in response to his words, a new sound drifted across the night air. It was barely audible, but unmistakably deliberate, the sound of many voices coordinating in what could only be described as communication. The infected weren't just thinking. They were talking. Dawn brought no relief, only the harsh clarity of daylight revealing the true scope of their situation. Casimir stood at his observation post, counting at least 60 infected now surrounding the mall in carefully maintained positions. They had used the night hours to bring in reinforcements, and their deployment showed an understanding of siege tactics that no mindless creature should possess. Sleep had been impossible for most of the defenders, and exhaustion was beginning to show in drawn faces and nervous gestures. Thaddeus moved through the defensive positions, checking weapons and redistributing ammunition. His military experience told him they were facing a professionally planned siege, but everything he knew about infected behavior said such planning was impossible. The contradiction gnawed at him, making every tactical decision feel like a guess rather than a calculated strategy. His scarred hands checked and rechecked his rifle, a nervous habit developed over years of combat that had never felt quite so inadequate. "They're digging," reported Dmitri from his position overlooking the eastern approach. His farmer's eye for land management had noticed what others missed. The infected weren't just waiting, they were engaged in construction. Small groups were excavating positions, creating what looked suspiciously like fortified positions. "They're building siege works. Actual earthworks, like something from a history book." Alicia felt her medical supplies dwindling with each minor injury and stress-related collapse among the defenders. But more concerning was the psychological toll she observed in her patients. People who had survived 2 years of apocalyptic horror were showing signs of breaking under the strain of facing an enemy that challenged their most basic assumptions about survival. Her training in trauma medicine was being tested in ways no medical school had prepared her for. "We need to consider the possibility that this isn't about taking our settlement," Isadora said during the morning strategy meeting. Her historical perspective was revealing patterns that the others missed. Siege warfare was often about destroying morale rather than walls. If these infected can think strategically, they might be trying to break us psychologically before they attack physically. Serafina's radio equipment was providing increasingly disturbing intelligence from other settlements. 3 communities had gone silent during the night, their emergency beacon simply stopping transmission without distress calls or explanations. The pattern suggested something was systematically eliminating survivor groups across the region, and their mall was just one target in a larger campaign. "The children are asking questions I can't answer," Isadora continued, her voice strained from the night spent comforting frightened families. "How do I explain to a 10-year-old that the monsters might be smarter than we are? How do I maintain hope when I'm not sure there's reason for it?" The morning's first crisis came when their water system began showing signs of tampering. Dmitri discovered that the infected had somehow identified and begun interfering with their external water lines, demonstrating knowledge of infrastructure that should have been beyond their capabilities. The psychological impact of realizing their enemies understood siege warfare well enough to target vital supplies was devastating. "We have 3 days of stored water," Dmitri reported, his usual optimism notably absent. "Less if we're conservative with rationing. They're not just attacking our defenses, they're attacking our ability to survive a prolonged siege." Casimir found himself questioning every assumption that had guided their settlement's construction. He had designed their fortifications against mindless hordes, not thinking enemies capable of analyzing his engineering choices and developing countermeasures. The weight of responsibility for 44 lives pressed down on him as he realized how unprepared they were for this new reality. The afternoon brought a new horror. The infected began displaying captured supplies and equipment from other settlements, arranging them in clear view of the mall's windows. The message was unmistakable: other communities had fallen, and their possessions were trophies. But more disturbing was the way the infected arranged these displays with an understanding of psychological warfare that suggested sophisticated intelligence. "That's Henderson's radio equipment," Serafina said quietly, recognizing gear from a settlement they had been in contact with just 2 days earlier. "And those medical supplies, they're from the clinic 40 miles north." The implications of such coordination across vast distances were staggering. Thaddeus gathered his most experienced fighters for a desperate planning session. "We can't win a siege against an enemy that thinks like we do but doesn't need food, water, or sleep," he said bluntly. "Our advantages are technology and individual intelligence. Their advantages are numbers, coordination, and endurance." "What about breaking out?" asked one of the younger defenders, though the question carried little hope. "To where?" Thaddeus responded. "If this is happening across the entire region, there might not be anywhere safe to run to. The breaking point came as evening fell. A single infected individual approached the main entrance under what appeared to be a flag of truce, a piece of white cloth attached to a makeshift pole. The creature showed no signs of the decay and degradation typical of the infected, and moved with purpose and intelligence that was undeniably human-like. "It wants to communicate," Alicia observed from her medical station, her voice filled with a mixture of fascination and horror. "We're not just facing predators anymore. We're facing something that might once have been human and retained enough intelligence to want to negotiate." Casimir stared down at the creature through his binoculars, noting the careful way it positioned itself within voice range but beyond weapon range. The infected individual stood with patience that spoke of strategic thinking, waiting for a response to its unprecedented gesture. "What do we do?" asked Isadora, voicing the question that hung in everyone's mind. "How do you negotiate with something that shouldn't be able to negotiate?" The creature below raised what appeared to be a crude megaphone, fashioned from salvaged materials with the same ingenuity that humans might display. When it spoke, its voice was clear and unmistakably intelligent, carrying across the parking lot with words that changed everything. "We wish to discuss terms," the creature called out, its voice carrying the inflections of rational thought. "You have something we need. We have something you need. Communication benefits survival for all parties." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of 44 people simultaneously realizing that the world had changed in ways they were completely unprepared to face. The community gathered in stunned silence as Casimir made the decision that would define their future. Against every instinct developed over 2 years of fighting the infected, he chose to respond to the creature's request for communication. Standing at the main entrance barricade, he called out through a makeshift megaphone that Serafina had quickly assembled from salvaged electronics. "We're listening," Casimir announced, his voice carrying across the parking lot to where the infected representative waited with inhuman patience. "But we maintain our defensive positions. Any aggressive movement ends this conversation." The creature below nodded with a gesture so fundamentally human that it sent chills through the watching defenders. When it spoke again, its voice carried inflections and vocabulary that suggested not just intelligence, but education. "I am the one you would call a spokesperson. We have evolved beyond your previous understanding of our kind. This evolution brings both opportunity and necessity for cooperation." Thaddeus positioned his rifle with the spokesman in clear sight, though he wasn't sure bullets would matter against something that had already died once. His military training had prepared him for many scenarios, but negotiating with intelligent undead wasn't covered in any tactical manual. "What kind of cooperation?" he called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to dangerous situations. "Survival requires resources. Your settlement possesses medical knowledge and technological capabilities. Our collective possesses numerical strength and coordination across vast territories." The creature paused, allowing the implications to settle. Mutual benefit is possible through structured cooperation rather than continued conflict. Alicia felt her medical training warring with her human revulsion as she studied the spokesman through binoculars. The creature showed signs of preservation that suggested intelligence had somehow arrested the normal decay process. Its careful word choices and diplomatic approach indicated not just retained cognitive function, but the development of new social structures among the infected. "What exactly are you proposing?" Casimir asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. The possibility of coexistence with intelligent infected challenged every assumption their survival had been built upon. "Protected status for your settlement in exchange for medical services," the spokesman replied. "Our collective has members who retained partial cognitive function but require treatment for deterioration. Your medical expertise could stabilize these individuals, expanding our intelligent population." Dmitri felt his stomach turn as the implications became clear. They were being asked to help create more intelligent infected, essentially farming human intelligence for creatures that had once been their enemies. His connection to the land and growing things made the proposal feel like the ultimate perversion of natural order. "You're asking us to help you recruit," Isadora said quietly to the other leaders, her historical knowledge providing context for what they were witnessing. This isn't just evolution, it's the beginning of a new civilization built on the ruins of our own. Serafina's radio equipment crackled with emergency transmissions from distant settlements, providing real-time updates on similar negotiations occurring across the region. The coordinated nature of these simultaneous conversations revealed the scope of infected organization and suggested they were facing something far larger than a local phenomenon. Other communities have accepted these terms, the spokesman continued, apparently aware of the radio chatter. Resistance has proven costly. Cooperation has proven mutually beneficial. We offer protection from both our kind and the chaotic infected who lack our intelligence. Your settlement becomes a protected medical facility within our territorial network. The offer hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. Accepting meant abandoning their independence and becoming vassals to an infected intelligence network. Refusing meant facing a siege they were unlikely to survive. Casimir found himself weighing the survival of his people against their humanity, a calculation no engineer had ever prepared him to make. We need time to consider, Casimir called out, playing for time while his mind raced through possibilities. Time is acceptable, the spokesman replied. But consider that other settlements have discovered the benefits of cooperation. Isolated communities face elimination by chaotic infected or absorption by territorial conflicts. Protected communities thrive within our network. Thaddeus moved quietly among the defenders, reading their faces and gauging morale. The psychological impact of negotiating with intelligent infected was devastating to people who had spent 2 years viewing them as mindless threats. Some looked ready to fight to the death rather than consider cooperation. Others appeared curious about the possibility of survival through accommodation. What guarantees do we have? Alicia called out, her medical ethics compelling her to understand the full scope of what was being proposed. How do we know you'll honor any agreement? Observe, the spokesman replied, then made a gesture toward the surrounding infected forces. Immediately, half of them began withdrawing to positions further from the mall, demonstrating both the speaker's authority and the coordinated nature of their organization. Good faith requires demonstration. We offer partial de-escalation as evidence of our commitment to negotiated solutions. The gesture was both reassuring and terrifying, proving that the infected possessed not just intelligence but sophisticated command structures capable of coordinated military operations across vast distances. The implications for human survival were staggering. How long do we have to decide? Casimir asked, though he already suspected the answer would determine whether they had any real choice in the matter. Dawn, the spokesman replied simply. Other settlements have found that extended deliberation leads to unfortunate complications. Swift decisions facilitate smoother transitions. As the creature withdrew to a respectful distance, maintaining the truce while clearly ending the immediate negotiation, Casimir gathered his leadership team for the most important discussion of their lives. They had 12 hours to decide between cooperation with intelligent infected or resistance that would likely mean the end of their community. The question was no longer whether they could survive the zombie apocalypse, but whether they could survive its evolution into something far more complex and morally ambiguous than they had ever imagined. The Leadership Council convened in the old jewelry store that served as their most secure meeting space, its former display cases now holding emergency supplies rather than precious metals. The weight of their impossible decision pressed down on everyone present as they faced a choice that would determine not just their survival, but their humanity. Casimir looked around the table at faces etched with exhaustion and fear, knowing that whatever they decided would haunt them for whatever time they had left. Thaddeus spoke first, his military pragmatism cutting through the emotional complexity of their situation. From a tactical standpoint, we can't win a prolonged siege against an organized enemy with unlimited numbers and no need for rest or supplies. They've demonstrated intelligence, coordination, and patience. Fighting them would be suicide. He paused, his scarred hands clenched on the table. But the alternative means becoming collaborators with something that was once human and chose to become something else. Alicia struggled with the medical implications of the proposed arrangement. Her oath to do no harm conflicted with the reality that helping the infected might be the only way to save the people under her care. If their claims are true, we could be preserving human knowledge and medical expertise within their network. The alternative might be watching everything we've learned die with us. She looked up from her notes, pain evident in her eyes. But we'd be helping create more of them. More intelligence trapped in dead bodies. Dmitri had spent the night walking through their greenhouse, touching the plants they'd cultivated with such hope and care. The agricultural programs they'd developed represented humanity's future, but that future required people to nurture it. The children deserve a chance to grow up, he said quietly. Even if the world they inherit isn't the one we hoped for. Isadora had been consulting her historical texts, looking for precedents for their situation in the long record of human conflict and cooperation. Throughout history, civilizations have faced choices between cultural preservation and physical survival. Sometimes cooperation with former enemies becomes the foundation for new forms of society. She traced patterns on her maps with a shaking finger. But we're not just talking about cultural accommodation. We're talking about biological transformation. Serafina's radio equipment had been monitoring communications throughout the night, providing updates on other settlements' decisions. 17 communities within our communication range have accepted their terms, she reported, her voice hollow. 3 have gone silent after refusing. The choice appears to be cooperation or extinction. The debate continued through the early morning hours, with each leader wrestling with implications that had no precedent in human experience. They discussed escape plans that would leave their life's work behind, resistance strategies that would likely result in total casualties, and cooperation terms that would preserve their people at the cost of their independence. "What about the children?" asked Isadora, voicing the concern that weighed on everyone's minds. "Do we have the right to make this choice for them? To decide that survival in this form is better than the alternative?" Casimir had been calculating structural load limits for potential escape routes, but his engineering mind kept returning to the same conclusion. Every bridge I ever designed had to account for loads that might exceed its specifications. When that happens, you either reinforce the structure or watch it collapse. He looked around the table at his fellow leaders. We're facing loads we never designed for. The question is whether we can reinforce our humanity enough to survive accommodation with something that challenges our most basic assumptions about what it means to be alive. Alicia made the observation that crystallized their dilemma. We've spent 2 years learning to survive the zombie apocalypse. Now we have to learn to survive its aftermath, a world where intelligence isn't limited to the living, where cooperation might mean compromising everything we thought defined humanity. As dawn approached, the settlement's children were brought down from their secure areas to participate in a community meeting. Casimir had insisted that any decision affecting their future should include their voices, even if the complexity of the situation was difficult for young minds to grasp. 10-year-old Marcus, one of Isadora's best students, raised his hand with the directness that only children possess. "Are the zombies still trying to eat us, or do they want to be friends now?" The simplicity of the question cut through hours of complex moral reasoning. Alicia knelt down to the child's level, choosing her words carefully. "They're offering to protect us if we help them with medicine. But accepting their help means living in a world very different from the one we've been trying to rebuild." "Will we still be people?" asked Sarah, a teenager who had grown up during the apocalypse and known no other world. The question hung in the air without an easy answer. Being human had once seemed like a simple biological fact, but intelligence arising in the infected challenged those definitions. Would they still be human if they cooperated with the undead? Would humanity survive in any meaningful form within an infected-dominated civilization? "We'll still be us," Casimir said finally, hoping it was true. "We'll still care about each other, still work to build something better, still teach and learn and grow things. The circumstances will be different, but who we are doesn't have to change." The vote, when it came, was unanimous. Not because everyone agreed with the choice, but because everyone agreed that their community's survival required unity. They would accept the infected spokesperson's terms, preserve their medical knowledge and agricultural expertise within the new order, and hope that cooperation would allow some form of human civilization to continue. As Casimir prepared to announce their decision to the waiting spokesman, Dmitri made one final observation that would haunt them all. "We're not just surviving the zombie apocalypse anymore. We're helping to build whatever comes after it." The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as Casimir stepped forward to address their new future, knowing that their choice would ripple through history in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. 6 months after the agreement, Casimir stood in what had once been the mall's anchor department store, now converted into a medical research facility that served both human and infected patients. The irony wasn't lost on him that the space once dedicated to selling consumer goods had become a laboratory for redefining life itself. Through the reinforced windows, he could see the expanded settlement that stretched beyond the original mall structure, a hybrid community that challenged every assumption about post-apocalyptic survival. Alicia had become the head of what they now called the Preservation Medical Institute, treating both humans and the infected individuals who retained enough cognitive function to benefit from intervention. Her patient roster included former teachers, engineers, artists, and scientists whose deaths had been incomplete, leaving them trapped between life and decay but retaining the knowledge that made them valuable to the new order. The work was emotionally devastating and scientifically fascinating in equal measure. Patient 47 is responding well to the neural stabilization treatment, she reported during their weekly leadership meeting, her voice carrying the professional detachment she developed to cope with her new reality. Dr. Harrison, before his transformation, was a neurosurgeon. His retained knowledge of brain anatomy has been invaluable in developing treatments for other partially cognitive infected. The treatments themselves represented a breakthrough in understanding the boundary between life and death. By stabilizing neural pathways in newly infected individuals who retained cognitive function, they could arrest the normal decay process and preserve human knowledge within undead bodies. It was medical progress built on ethical foundations that none of them felt entirely comfortable with. Thaddeus had adapted his security protocols to manage a community that included both living and undead residents. The infected who lived among them posed no threat to the humans, but their presence required constant vigilance and careful management. His daily patrols now included infected guards who could work continuously without rest, providing security capabilities that human guards couldn't match. "The perimeter is more secure than it's ever been," he reported, though his tone carried the weight of someone still processing the moral implications of his work. "The infected security force doesn't need sleep, food, or medical attention. But commanding people who died and came back." He shook his head. "It's not something any military training prepared me for." Dimitri's agricultural programs had expanded dramatically with infected labor that could work around the clock without fatigue. The productivity gains were remarkable, but the sight of undead hands tending to living plants created a surreal landscape that still disturbed him. His greenhouse had become a massive complex providing food for multiple communities within the infected territorial network. "Crop yields are up 300% from our pre-agreement levels," he reported, consulting charts that documented their agricultural success. "The infected workers can maintain perfect schedules, optimal care cycles, and continuous monitoring. From a practical standpoint, it's the most efficient farming operation I've ever seen." He paused, staring out at fields where the dead tended crops that would feed the living. But efficiency isn't everything. Isadora had established schools that served both human children and infected individuals who retained learning capacity. The classroom dynamics were unlike anything in educational history, with undead students who possessed decades of experience learning alongside living children who would inherit a world beyond anything previous generations had imagined. "The knowledge transfer is remarkable," she said, though her voice carried notes of sadness that hadn't been there before the agreement. "Infected individuals can share experiences and expertise that would otherwise be lost to death. But watching children normalize conversation with the undead." She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Serafina's communication network had expanded to connect dozens of communities within the infected territorial system, creating an information exchange that spanned hundreds of miles. The infected possessed communication capabilities that surpassed anything humans had achieved post-apocalypse, but their network came with surveillance and control implications that made privacy a relic of the old world. "We're connected to 47 settlements now," she reported, monitoring transmissions that flowed through both human and infected communication systems. Information sharing, resource coordination, and technological development are advancing faster than ever before. But everything we say, everything we do, is observed and recorded by the infected administrative network. The children had adapted to their new reality with the resilience that had always characterized human youth, but their normalcy in the presence of intelligent undead troubled the adults who remembered the world before. 10-year-old Marcus now helped infected individuals with basic motor function exercises, treating it as just another part of his education. Teenager Sarah had developed a friendship with an infected former artist who taught her painting techniques while she helped him maintain the fine motor control needed for creative work. "The children don't see the moral complexity we do," Isadora observed during one of their private discussions. "To them, this is just the world. They don't mourn the human civilization we lost because they're building something new from what remains." The agreement had indeed provided security and prosperity that exceeded their previous survival efforts, but it had come at costs they were still calculating. Human independence was gone, replaced by protected status within a larger infected civilization. Cultural autonomy existed only within boundaries defined by undead administrators who valued human knowledge but didn't necessarily understand human values. "We saved our people," Casimir said during their final meeting before the first anniversary of the agreement. "We preserved human knowledge, maintained our community, and found a way to thrive in a world that seemed determined to destroy us. But the question that haunts me is whether what we preserved is still recognizably human." Outside the mall, the sun set over a settlement that bustled with activity from both living and undead residents. Gardens tended by tireless infected hands stretched toward the horizon. Schools where human children learned alongside undead teachers echoed with lessons that bridged life and death. Medical facilities where human doctors treated both living and undead patients pushed the boundaries of what science thought possible. They had survived the zombie apocalypse and helped build whatever came after. Whether that represented triumph or tragedy would be left for future generations to judge, generations that would inherit a world where the line between life and death had been redrawn by necessity, cooperation, and the simple human drive to keep existing in whatever form survival required. As Casimir walked through the evening settlement, watching infected guards maintain vigilant patrols while human families gathered for dinner, he couldn't shake the feeling that they had saved